Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video episode, I'll continue to cover alternatives that NASA might be considering in case something is missing when the space agency wants to fly the Artemis III mission. We're still a couple of years away from that at least, but NASA officials broached the possibility a year and a half ago, and then, for the most part, they stopped bringing it up. Although it's not like us media types didn't notice, and we bring it up often. NASA has needed to be flexible about mission plans and schedules, sometimes memorably, going back to Apollo. So this wouldn't be surprising given the complex Artemis organization that the space agency is trying to steer in the same direction. We've had a few introductions to this topic this year, particularly after one standout idea was reported 6 months ago. If Starship wasn't ready to go to the moon in 2026, then the idea was, or is, to fly Orion on a low Earth orbit mission to rendezvous and dock with the Starship HLS prototype there. SpaceX has launched 4 prototypes so far and is hoping to get a license for the 5th test flight in the coming days. They are still iterating on reusability, which is a foundation of the system. SpaceX was already behind Artemis schedules that themselves are being delayed, but with further technology beyond that to demonstrate, develop, and iterate on, it's not clear how soon SpaceX will be ready to fly the Starship tech demonstrations that NASA needs for Artemis III. It's also difficult to tell when a Starship lunar lander will be able to go to the moon. If this upcoming 5th Starship flight test is completed in the next few weeks, hopefully SpaceX will update the critical path and schedule leading up to the Artemis flight test demonstrations. But it may be similar to the aftermath from the highly successful IFT-4 launch in June, where the progress was obvious and there was talk about the very next flight test, but there was little from SpaceX about the forward outlook and schedule beyond that. Let's pick up from there with a deeper dive into the background of why NASA would want to look at alternatives instead of just waiting until everything was ready. First, let's go into how we got here. There wasn't much public discussion about alternatives to the Artemis III mission until last year in 2023. The schedules for all the programs were already seen as aspirational, with maybe the exception of Exploration Ground Systems, since they are the only one that is doing a more straightforward turnaround between Artemis II and III. The original Artemis III goal was once again fashioned by today's politicians after the President Kennedy goal in the 1960s. This has happened more than once in the last 50 years, but only Apollo saw a financial and resource commitment to match that challenge. NASA funding is not completely a zero-sum game, but it usually resembles one from year to year, and sometimes it's easy to mistake it for a zero-sum game, such as when it truly is. For Artemis, the appointed NASA leadership wanted to increase investment in lunar lander development by cutting funding for SLS. Leadership and other members in Congress said they were interested in a lunar lander, but few were willing to do that at the expense of SLS. This conflict, in 2019 and 2020, between the Trump administration and Congress resembled a similar conflict between the previous Obama administration and Congress in 2010. Neither White House had a consensus of support, or the votes, and the congressional priorities enacted almost exactly 14 years ago in 2010 remain in place. Okay, so back to Artemis III. The Trump administration announced the goal of a crewed Artemis lunar landing by the end of 2024, and once again Congress rejected the White House spending plan. NASA turned to SpaceX in 2021, sole sourcing the HLS Option A lander to them. Providers were going to have to self-fund, and SpaceX was the only one that the NASA Selection Board judged to have a strong enough financial commitment outside of government funding. SpaceX believed that their Starship system that was already in development would be able to meet the December 31st, 2024 deadline for the Artemis III lunar landing. But that sole source Option A award in April 2021 was protested, and it wasn't decided in court until November of that year. That was around the same time as a NASA Inspector General report that reviewed HLS was published. The IG 22003 report found that the HLS development schedule was unrealistic. OIG reported that as of August 2021, SpaceX planned the first Starship flight test just a few months later, by late 2021. That would be followed by the propellant transfer demonstration at the end of 2022, the uncrewed lunar landing demonstration for Starship HLS in 2023, and the crewed demonstration that was part of the Artemis III mission was pointed at that end of 2024 deadline. The government programs are not as proprietary, and so there was a lot more information about delays to Artemis I and II. That same OIG report projected that Artemis I was sliding towards the summer of 2022, and that Artemis II would be delayed until at least mid-2024. Right after the Blue Origin court case was dismissed in early November 2021, NASA officially acknowledged for the first time that Artemis III would not happen until 2025 at the earliest, also announcing at the same time that they rebaselined Artemis II to May 2024. By early 2022, NASA had changed Artemis III from the end of 2024 to the middle of 2025 on their working manifest. The uncrewed lunar landing demonstration for Starship HLS was forecast for the first half of 2024 now, which at that point was about 2 years away. After Artemis I finally launched and flew a highly successful mission in late 2022, those government programs were seen to be nearing crewed lunar capability, and more attention turned to the uncertainty about Artemis III. In early 2023, the schedule had changed by a few months from the year before. The Artemis III date had moved to the end of 2025, and the uncrewed lunar landing demonstration was shown on the manifest as somewhere in 2024, which often means by the end of the year. The first Starship flight test occurred in April 2023, but that launch unintentionally excavated the launch pad and its foundation during liftoff and initial motion, and fueled more questions about the schedule. It was at that time in 2023, in mid-May, when NASA started publicly discussing what they might do if Orion and SLS were ready to go to the gateway orbit on Artemis III, but the other pieces were not. After the change in administrations in 2021, the Artemis III goal was eventually delayed by a year to the end of 2025. But it wasn't clear what that date represented. Was it a forecast of Orion and SLS readiness, or when all the programs would be ready to fly? By the time that Artemis III was delayed to September 2026 in January, NASA internally had an agency baseline commitment saying Starship might not be in lunar orbit ready to support Artemis III until February 2028. Given all the other issues for the Artemis programs, one question is, why not just wait? The difference between the current date and the Joint Confidence Level date is about 18 months, but that's likely to get smaller and smaller as incremental delays are seen for all the programs. Eventually, it might be the case that the wait is for the rest of the steps before Artemis III, like Artemis II. If Artemis II is delayed to deal with the heat shield, that will consume a big chunk of the current 18-month difference. One of the primary reasons why NASA doesn't want to wait is because the space agency and its oversight bodies, in particular the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, have a long-standing concern about the long gaps between Artemis flights. An example that illustrates how highly this goal is valued is Mobile Launcher 2. The ASAP's 2017 annual report recommended that Congress buy another mobile launcher rather than accept the forecast of a 3-year gap between the flights now known as Artemis I and II. Although we're seeing a 2-year gap open up to 3 years right now, that previous 3-year gap was only a forecast to convert the existing mobile launcher rather than build a second one. There's a good chance the 33-month forecast to do that conversion would have expanded, similarly to what has been seen with the growth of the Mobile Launcher 2 build. But that concern about a low flight rate and the desire to keep operational skills sharp was a strong enough argument, at least as one of the bigger arguments, to build another mobile launcher. After Artemis I was completed, there was hope that the programs were making progress towards reaching the goal of flying one Artemis mission per year. As I've noted in a previous video or two, NASA has planned to fly Artemis III 1 year after Artemis II for a while, or at least kept that goal in the plans. The first forum that NASA exploration officials discussed this was at the May 15, 2023 session of the NASA Advisory Council Human Exploration and Operations Committee. At that time, the head of the Exploration Directorate, Jim Free, and the chair of the committee, Wayne Hale, discussed the issue of the cadence of flights again.
And then, I'm always looking for advice of, we've been tasked with getting this cadence, this yearly cadence. what are the pitfalls that we can get into with that? What do we need to be concerned about? Where do you think we're doing things right based on our plans? So I'd highlight those two things, Wayne, if you could.
So,
think about
we've,
that.
at this committee, we have had a long-standing recommendation that you try to get to at least a yearly flight rate. And, based on my experience, and I think several of the other folks' experience, it's difficult to maintain proficiency, which actually becomes a mission assurance or safety thing with a very low flight rate. As a matter of fact, one wishes it was more than once a year. It all goes back to budget, but it certainly is true. The longer you go between missions, the harder it is for folks to develop that muscle memory of how to actually execute the missions. And we certainly went through a couple of periods in the shuttle where we had longer stand downs, and it was difficult to gear back up and go again. So, at least from my personal standpoint, once a year is probably about the minimum for a truly safe, to keep from incurring an inordinate amount of human errors.
Right.
In a subsequent presentation, Amit Kshatriya, Deputy Associate Administrator of the Moon to Mars Program Office, talked about the importance of flying and flying with available hardware.
To pull on a little bit what Jim said earlier, because of the dependence on that, we are looking at all options, and we've asked all of our contractors to bring their production in as much as they can, because of course we really, really want to fly this mission the way we have designed it. But the other important thing, as you mentioned, from an assurance standpoint, is to keep flying. So we were asking everyone to aggregate as much hardware as they can for us, either in the NRHO or at KSC. And then depending on where we are with the rest of the production, just like they did during Apollo, where they downmoded and they flew missions when the LEM wasn't available, we will choose those missions based on the hardware that's available. So that's kind of our overarching strategy.
That was a reference to the famous decision to fly an alternate Apollo mission as Apollo 8 on the first crewed Saturn V launch. NASA had formulated a sequence of 7 missions with letter designations from A through G in 1967, but the lunar module was not ready to fly at the end of 1968. That was the D mission, which was the first crewed flight test of the lunar module. Without the LEM available, NASA inserted a C' mission in between the C mission, Apollo 7, and the D mission, which ended up flying as Apollo 9. The C' mission went into low lunar orbit with only the command service modules. After another presentation to the NASA Academies in early June and further information about the post-launch assessments from the first Starship flight test in April 2023, Mr. Free was asked multiple questions about Artemis III at a rare media briefing on Artemis on August 8, 2023. Which was the first opportunity of that kind after the public federal advisory presentations in May and June. During the media questions part of the briefing, Mr. Free again noted that NASA was looking at different missions for Artemis III.
First, we have a question with Marcia Dunn with the AP.
Marcia Dunn, Associated Press. Maybe for Mr. Free, or I don't know. What's your working target date for Artemis III? Is it still late 25? And
so for Artemis III, we're still working to our contractual dates with everyone, which is the December of 25. We did receive a updated schedule from SpaceX that we're looking to get some more detail on. We were at Starbase a couple weeks ago and really spent some time going through their major milestones to the Artemis III mission, which includes a prop transfer mission, as well as the uncrewed demo. So really kind of sharing our philosophy, their philosophy, where they are with the hardware, trying to understand their schedule some more. So I think we'll look at that and update around that in the near future after we have some time to digest it. But what we're holding all the contractors to is that December of 25 date. We may end up flying a different mission if that's the case. If we have these big slips out, we've looked at can we do other missions if the possibility exists there. But right now we're still trying to look at their schedule. The spacesuits are heading to PDR in October. So that's obviously another piece of hardware that is on the path, the critical path to that mission.
And in a follow-up, talked about the International Space Station program's model for its assembly sequence.
Next, we have another question on the phone. Andrea Leinfelder with the Houston Chronicle.
Hi, this question is for Jim. I was hoping you could give a little more detail on what you meant by saying we might fly a different mission. Like, are you suggesting that if the lander isn't ready in time, maybe you'll fly astronauts around the moon for a second time? Thank you.
I think we're always one of the things Pam talked, and I'm not going to get her words right, so I won't even try. But a few months ago about what we learned from ISS. I think one thing we learned from ISS is to make sure we're flexible so we keep human spaceflight viable. And one of the things that ISS did was really look at the assembly sequence as hardware was available and it wasn't. I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. That's what I was referring to, is we're trying to look at all the missions we could fly to keep learning. We may fly 2 and want to fly a different mission for 3 because we want to understand how the system works better. I don't want to look at it as a negative of, hey, we might not fly 3 the same way. For me, it's continuing to learn to do exactly what Reed said so that eventually we're putting humans on Mars. We're not going to accomplish everything in one mission. We shouldn't expect to. What we should do is expect to fly it safely and advance our cause of understanding, to do our science, but cause of understanding of our vehicles and systems.
One example of this was early in the ISS assembly sequence. The ISS 2A mission launched Node 1 on the space shuttle to attach with the American-bought, Russian-built FGB module. The next American space shuttle assembly flight in the sequence was the 3A mission, which would have flown after the Russian service module was launched and docked to the other end of the FGB. In between the 2A and 3A missions, the A indicating American, a 2A.1 mission was inserted in between 2A and the Russian service module 1R launch. And then a 2A.2 mission was inserted between the 1R launch and the 3A mission. Due to delays with preparing the ISS service module for launch, NASA ended up splitting the 2A.2 mission into 2, a 2A.2A mission and a 2A.2B mission. And during the course of the assembly sequence, multiple .1 logistics and assembly missions were added to the sequence. But that flexibility with the ISS assembly sequence was due to the higher availability of the space shuttle at that point in its program life. Right now, NASA has availability issues with all the programs, either production of Orion and SLS vehicles or with development of Starship. About a year ago, I wrote a story about the lack of SLS inventory for NSF, which is the limiting factor between Orion and SLS right now. As it stands, the Artemis III, Orion, and SLS flight units might be ready to stack sometime in 2026. As I've noted many times in coming back to this storyline, that's the last of the interim cryogenic propulsion stage units that NASA fully purchased. After that, SLS won't be able to fly again until the exploration upper stage and the aforementioned Mobile Launcher 2 are ready. But that's Artemis IV. Right now, the subject is alternatives for Artemis III, or whatever an alternate mission might be designated. It's an if, but if we assume that the Artemis III, Orion, and SLS were ready in a couple of years, and they were ready to fly to the Gateway's near rectilinear halo orbit, a couple of alternatives would be 1, to visit the Gateway and NRHO, or 2, to fly to NRHO by itself. Those missions would have the same objectives for Orion and SLS as the baseline Artemis III mission. SLS would put Orion on a translunar injection trajectory like it did on Artemis I. Orion would perform an outbound powered flyby of the moon as it did on Artemis I, except it would target NRHO this time. A mission to NRHO that would rendezvous and dock with the Gateway is an obvious alternative, but the Gateway is also delayed. The formal agency baseline commitment is December 2027 for its launch. The initial Gateway elements, the power and propulsion element, and an initial habitation module were originally a part of the Artemis III mission, but they predate the Artemis rebranding and the pivot by NASA in 2019 to prioritize investing in commercial lunar lander development and deprioritizing the Gateway. Before that change 5 years ago, the PPE and a utilization module were planned to be the first Gateway elements, with PPE flying on a commercial launch vehicle and the utilization module being brought up by Orion on Exploration Mission 3. After EM3 became the end of 2024 lunar landing mission in March 2019 and was renamed a few weeks later to Artemis III, those two elements remained a part of the critical path for the mission. Instead of flying on SLS, which had already run into cost and schedule problems by 2019, the utilization or minimal habitation module would also launch on a commercial booster and use integrated tug capabilities to rendezvous and dock with PPE. That mini-hab module would be able to hold additional logistics that could extend Orion's crewed capabilities beyond its 4-person, 21-day requirement for standalone missions. That didn't last that long, though. After NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine fired Bill Gerstenmaier as head of NASA's Exploration Directorate, he brought Doug Lavero in, and as a part of the Artemis risk assessment conducted at the end of 2019 and early 2020, it was decided to dock the PPE and mini-hab module, now called the Habitation and Logistics Outpost, or HALO, on the ground. But it was also decided that launch of the Gateway would be deferred until after Artemis III to reduce mission risks to the lunar landing mission. Still, when the launch contract for the initial Gateway modules, the PPE and HALO, was awarded in February 2021, the target launch date was no earlier than May 2024. NASA's target launch date was October 2025 at the beginning of this year, when the space agency announced they were reviewing that. Late last year, the baseline commitment was internally set, as mentioned earlier, as December 2027. It will take the PPE over a year to propel the co-manifested vehicle from the Falcon Heavy drop-off in Earth orbit to NRHO. But even if the initial modules were there at the end of 2027, that's probably later than NASA would want to fly another mission. As it is, it's more likely that Gateway won't be in NRHO until 2029 at the end of the decade. A standalone crewed Orion mission to NRHO probably could buy down some risk, but it would not test the rendezvous, proximity operations, and docking capability upgrade that Orion is getting on Artemis III. In addition to the NASA Docking System Block 2 hardware and other rendezvous equipment, the Orion flight software is also being upgraded to meet the fully automated rendezvous and docking requirement for the spacecraft. That's likely one of the factors that makes a rendezvous and docking demonstration desirable on Artemis III, and probably one of the arguments for studying the mission concept of a low Earth orbit docking of Orion to a Starship HLS prototype. And I'll cover that in more detail in the next episode. Thanks as always for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. I'll put together an extra episode like this when there's time or a strong reason, but I'll continue to wrap up the news on the weekend with a video report. Keep an eye out for the next one. Or go back and check out the last one.